Good morning to all of you. My name is Mark. I'm one of the ministers here at Sugar Grove, and I want to say welcome to all of you, especially you guys that are guests. I want to say welcome to all of those folks that are with us this morning live streaming. I understand there's quite a few of you, and I know that every Sunday morning, Doug says hello to his parents up in Chicago, and I don't see a reason to break that trend, right? So let me say good morning to you guys up in Chicago. Let me say, hey, good morning to Pinky Ryan, who's always with us every Sunday morning. I miss you, sweetie. Love you a whole lot. Glad that you're with us in this way. And all you other guys that are with us via live stream, we're glad that you're here today. By the way, does anybody, I'm just kind of curious, anybody watch any football yesterday? Could anybody tell me how the... That doesn't happen very often. I don't get a chance to do that, you know. And then on a Sunday when I'm preaching, yeah, it's pretty cool, you guys. Listen, a few weeks ago, Doug began a series on Jesus, the true and better. And in that series, we've been looking looking at Scripture with the notion that it's all about Jesus. All the Old Testament, the New Testament, everything is not about us. It's about Jesus Christ. And we've been looking at Old Testament characters to see how that's true, how Jesus is the true and better of all of those characters. A few weeks ago, we began by talking about Adam, that Jesus is the true and better Adam. A lot of that came out of Romans chapter 5, right? Because Adam, Paul calls him the first man. Through him, sin came into the world, and condemnation and guilt and all that junk that keeps you up at night because it's in your life and it's in my life. But Jesus, he says, the second man, brought righteousness, and he brought redemption, and he brought forgiveness, and he brought eternal life. That's the stuff that gets me up in the morning. That's the stuff that says, I don't care what else is going on. Let me tell you what, that's where I want to be. That's where I want to be. It's with Jesus Christ. Then he talked about Jesus, the true and better Noah. Then he talked about last week, Jesus, the true and better Abraham. This week we're talking about Jesus, the true and better Joseph. And I want to tell you that Joseph is one of my wife's favorite Old Testament characters. She's not with us this morning. She's back there with the children. But she'll tell you right quick, Joseph is her man. Actually, I'm her man. What happened to the mic? I don't know. How's that? Is that better? Okay. I'm still her man, right? Did y'all get that part? I'm her man, right? But she loves Joseph, the character that he plays. And when you look at the story of Joseph, you guys, it's filled with so many neat things. It's a story about the providence of God. That God is always there, even when you feel like maybe He's not. In those darkest hours, don't you ever forget God's leading and God's guiding. That's not the main thing we want to emphasize this morning when we talk about Jesus, the true and better. It's also a story about faith. Faith is a conquering power. When we walk by faith and we live in faith, we exercise our lives in faith. Let me tell you what, there's a transformation that occurs. Joseph is a great example of that, but that's not what we're here to talk about this morning. It's another aspect of his life that really highlights the ministry and the work of Jesus. That's what we want to talk about. And kind of get us into that, I want to make a confession to you this morning. And I got a guilty pleasure that I need to tell you about. Maybe it's not really a guilty pleasure because I don't know how many people... A guilty pleasure is something you enjoy that everybody else frowns on. And I don't think that all of you guys frown on it, but you may think, man, that's kind of weird for a preacher to be saying that. But I love revenge movies. Can I say that to you? Is it safe in here for me to say that? Man, listen, if I need to recharge, give me a bag of popcorn and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I'm going to town, you guys. I really am. I mean, that is great. Almost any Arnold Schwarzenegger movie is a good revenge movie. That's just, And there's been some great ones. Go online and look at the list of the top 50 revenge movies. I bet you've seen every one of them. You're saying, yeah, shame on you, Mark, but I bet you've seen every one of those movies. Some of those things they're awesome. Like Gladiator, to go back a few years. You remember that movie? I think it won an Academy Award, didn't it? I mean, it's one of those movies. A revenge movie is where somebody gets even, right? There's been an injustice. Something has happened that's not right, and you feel it down in your soul. You know what I mean? And by the time the movie ends, you are so ready for the bad guys to get it. You know what I mean? I mean, you just, there's something that kind of sparks on the inside of me when I see one of those, right? Unforgiven. Anybody ever seen Unforgiven? I think Clint Eastwood won an Academy Award for that movie. Listen, nobody is redeemable. There's no good people in the movie Unforgiven. But by the time it's over, there's one guy that's really, really bad. Gene Hackman plays his part. By the time Clint Eastwood unleashes on that guy, you're saying, yeah, shoot him again. I mean, it's just, Something. Now, and you're kind of laughing about that, but really, you have it down inside of you. We want to see justice served. We can't live with injustice. We don't like that. And that's not just you guys, right? That's anybody that's ever lived in every culture, in every time period. Everybody has a sense of justice and injustice. Now, what constitutes justice and injustice may shift a little bit from culture to culture, but everybody has that moral sense that something is right and something is wrong, right? And if injustice occurs, justice is what makes it right. In fact, it's so true that, everybody has that. Immanuel Kant, I don't know if you ever heard of that guy or not, he's a German philosopher. Immanuel Kant recognized that there's that sense of justice in everybody. He calls it a category of life. And he came to believe that there must be a God because everybody everywhere has that sense of justice. And the problem is that we've never seen real, full, unqualified justice in our lives. Where did that come from? It led him to believe that there must be a God that stands behind all of that. You and I have a fuller, deeper belief than what Immanuel Kant had, but you see the idea? You want to see justice served. I want to see justice served. I feel better when I see justice served. And we've all been on the downside of an injustice, right? We've all know what that feels like. I want to tell you about a lady named Johnine. Can't think of her last name right now. I'll think of it before it's all over. And I may have told you this story before. I have a vision in my mind that I'm speaking this story in a Bible class somewhere, but I can't really get my finger on it. Brooks is her last name, Johnine Brooks. She was a dental student. On her way to class one day, had some midterms to take in dental school. She's minding her own business, driving her car, and this jerk. Now, I would never call Mary Poppins a jerk. Do y'all understand what I'm saying? That's just not right. That's pretty near an injustice. You know what I'm saying? But this guy, amen, this guy was a jerk. He flies through that intersection and crushes the front end of her car. She can't even drive it. It was just out of the blue. It was totally his fault. And as he kind of spins around, he could drive away. As he kind of spins around, he looks at her like, "You dumb woman." And he drives off and he gives her a wave, one of those one-finger waves, right? And off he goes in a cloud of dust. She's so bumfuzzled, she didn't even know what kind of car it was. She didn't get the license plate number. And the people that saw it, nobody got a license plate number. This guy got away scot-free. Here she is, a dental student, trying to make ends meet, got bills to pay. Now she's got a car she can't drive. She's got to pay for all of those expenses and have it towed and get it fixed. And it just burned her. Listen, how many of you feel just a little burnt up on the inside about that when I tell you that? Okay, there's 12 people that have blood pumping today. The rest of you guys are not with it. I'm going to tell you what, that gets me going. So she gets over it. She gets out of dental school. She is a dentist, actually. Has been a dentist for about 10 years. When guess who walked into her office? He didn't recognize her, but she recognized him. And she said, "This won't hurt a bit." She lied. Now, why did you laugh at that? Because she got kind of medieval with this guy, to be honest with you. Why did you laugh at that? Well, because justice feels right. We want justice. But here's the thing about justice. And I want you to kind of hang on to this because it really plays strongly in our story of Joseph this morning. Here's the thing about justice. It's a two-edged sword. It not only cuts that way, but it cuts this way. And everybody in here, you got stuff that if you let it, it'll keep you up at night that you've done, right? Or thought, or felt, or been, or... And we know there's a dark little place on my soul where all of that stuff can kind of sit if I was to let it. Justice, if this were a universe where justice, where lex talionis was the law of the day. You ever heard that phrase, lex talionis? That's a Latin phrase that's used to describe the Old Testament. What it means is, if you're going to describe the Old Testament, here's the words that would really capture it. Eye for an eye. Yeah, what does that mean? Justice, baby. Justice. Because God is a holy God. It matters how we live. It matters what we do. And God is infinite in His justice. And justice says every sin, every wrongdoing, all of it, somebody's going to pay. somebody's going to pay. And I learned a long time ago, I was about 5 years old, that something is really, really, really wrong with me. I've got a dark spot inside. Now, 5 may be kind of young. For some of you guys, we all have different environments that we grow up in and all that other sort of stuff. But I want to tell you the honest truth. You will come to that conclusion if you've not come to it yet. You will have the sense something is not right here. I just can't seem to pull it off. Now, let's look at Joseph. You got all that? Now we're ready to talk about Joseph. What really speaks to me and points to Jesus, the true and better. Joseph, it's not a story about revenge. It's not a story about justice. It's a story about injustice and, thank God, forgiveness. That's what it's about. Let me tell you, here it is. Genesis 37. Open up. I'm not going to look at a lot of passages this morning because the story's too long. His narrative covers about a third of the book of Genesis, but I want you to kind of follow along. I'll try to think to say what chapter we're in and maybe a verse or two here and there so you can kind of follow. His story begins in earnest. The Joseph narrative begins in earnest in chapter 37 and verse 2. He's mentioned before then. He's mentioned back in chapter 35, but his story is not told until starting in about verse 2. He's a boy of 17. He's a punk teenager. All right? And the reason I say punk is because he had a privileged life. And that doesn't make you a punk necessarily, but he kind of lived that. He kind of let everybody else know that, right? Everything was handed to him. He was daddy's favorite. Everybody knew it. Daddy knew it. Joseph knew it. He had 11 brothers and a sister. They all knew it. Joseph is the favorite. He would tattle on his brothers sometimes. This is the opening verses of Genesis 37. Go and tell Dad really how the family was dysfunctional to start with, right? His father was Jacob, one of the patriarchs. Jacob's not a guy that I really admire a whole lot. He's kind of a pessimistic guy. He would never see a glass half full. It was always half empty. But he had some kind of rotten things that happened. He worked 7 years for his father-in-law to marry the love of his life, beautiful little girl named Rachel, only to find out on the wedding night that he had married not Rachel, but her sister Leah, kind of like, surprise. And he had to work another 7 years to get Rachel. So he has 2 wives, he's got 2 concubines, and through all of those, and that sounds odd to us, right? There's some cultural things going on with all of that we're not going to talk about. But through all of those ladies, he had 12 sons and a daughter named Dinah. And the love of his life was Joseph. It was the first son born to the woman that he really, really loved, and that was Rachel. And I mean, he was just full of Joseph. Jacob was. He even gave him, and Joseph lived into that, he even gave him a coat of many colors, or a richly ornamented coat. It's hard to translate the Hebrew words there. Maybe it was a coat that had a lot of colors. Maybe it was a coat that had stones, gems sewn into it, or little bells that would jingle when he would walk. But it was some way that everybody could know, he's the one. He's the one. But what really ripped the universe was when he started having dreams. These dreams came from God. God is telegraphing the future, all right? He starts to have dreams, and he tells his brothers. It's like he can't hardly wait to tell them. Listen, he says. That's the first word out of his mouth. He had a dream where they were all out in the field shocking grain, and his sheaf stood up straight, and the other sheaves, his brothers' sheaves, came and bowed down to him. Now, these are all older brothers, all of them older than him. And they all bowed down to him. And the text says they hated him for that. It's just another... here's the favorite. It's just another thing, right? Then he has another dream. He dreamed that the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. Now, God's telegraphing a message about something he's going to do down the way. He did that so that when it occurred, everybody would know. Joseph especially would know. But he goes and he tells his brothers, hey, what do you think? Look at that dream. I mean, they hated him, you guys. All right, that's the background. So here's what happens. I'm still in Genesis 37. The brothers all go off. They're shepherds. They're taking care of sheep. And Dad says to Joseph, why don't you go check on the boys, see how everything's going. So he goes. He finally finds them at a place called Dothan. And they see him before he gets there. They see him coming. Maybe it was his walk. When you're the favorite son, you kind of have a walk. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe it was the tinkling, jingling bells on his jacket. But here's what they said about verses 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there. They said, here comes that dreamer. The one that says we're going to all bow down to him. And then they hashed out a plan, kind of group think here. Let's kill him. Let's just kill him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. We'll see the big dreamer, let's see. Let's kill him. Reuben speaks up, said, well, let's throw him in the cistern over here. We don't want to shed his blood. Let's throw him in. A cistern was a hole in the ground that held water. This one didn't have any water in it. So let's just throw him in a cistern. Reuben's plan was to come back and get him later and return him to his dad, but he's hanging on with the brothers, right? So they're going to throw him in the cistern. The text doesn't say why Reuben was not there for this next part, but he clearly wasn't there when a caravan of Ishmaelites came by. And these are traders. They're going down to Egypt to sell spices and fabrics and all that sort of stuff. And Judah speaks up and says, hey, we ought not to kill him because he is our flesh and blood. Let's sell him into slavery and we'll never have to see him again. We make a little cash on the side on top of all of that. They sold him into slavery. When you get into chapter 42, the story gets recounted again. He is begging for his life to these brothers. I mean, they confess to each other. 22 years later, they remember how Joseph cried and begged for mercy, and they sold him anyway. You know why that still bothered them? Because they had a sense of justice as well, just like we do. They knew that was wrong. And there's nobody in here that has any problem realizing how wrong that was. Injustice. They sold their baby brother into slavery, took his coat, killed a goat, dipped the coat in the goat, covered it in blood, brought it back to Dad and said, hey, does this coat look familiar to you? We found out, could this be Joseph's coat? And Jacob, I don't think, ever quite recovered from that, at least for the next 22 years. His son, devoured by a ferocious beast, it just broke him. Joseph's got a little brother named Benjamin, also born to Rachel, the only two boys born to Rachel. Joseph and Benjamin were full brothers. He became very protective at that point of Benjamin, as you find out a little bit later in the story. But life goes on, right? Injustice. The people that bought him, the Ishmaelite traders, take him all the way down to Egypt and sell him to a guy named Potiphar, who's captain of the guard. I don't know exactly all the responsibilities that he had, but he's captain of the guard. It's kind of like, you remember that scene in Star Wars where they're looking at the little robots, the little drones? And he says, well, I'll take that one. Well, not. It's kind of what it was like. He said, I'll take, Potiphar says, I'll take this one. Puts him into service as a slave in his household, and he begins to realize God is blessing this guy. Potiphar recognizes it. God is blessing him, and before you know it, Joseph is in charge of all of Potiphar's household and all of his affairs and all that he does. The Bible says Potiphar did not concern himself with anything. Joseph just got in there and did it. God was blessing him, right? The only thing that he did not have anything to do with was Potiphar's food. People that were in leadership back in those days were pretty protective about their food. If you're going to take somebody out, the easiest way is to poison them. So he wasn't in charge of his food, but he was in charge of everything else. Now, there's something I bet some of us did not know in the Bible. I'm in Genesis 39 now, verse 6. A little note about Joseph. It says in the NIV, he was well built and handsome. Does that sound like something that the Bible would talk about? He was well built and handsome. Of course, it says about his mother, Rachel, that she was beautiful in face and form. I guess some pretty strong genes got handed down to Joseph. He's well built and handsome. I bet that escaped your attention. But let me tell you somebody's attention it did not escape. Mrs. Potiphar. And as I read this story, I get the idea that she'd done this before. She probably played with slave boys all the time. She decided, and nothing very subtle about Mrs. Potiphar. She says, come on, lie with me. It's a pretty vulgar term in Hebrew. Lie with me. And you know what Joseph did? I mean, so here he is. His brothers have betrayed him. Here he's off. He says, no, it's not right. I'm not going to do that. It'd be a violation of my relationship with Mr. Potiphar. No. She is not a person to give up. She goes after him every time she has an opportunity. I mean, let's do this. Finally, one day, all the servants are out of the house. Joseph walks in because he's got some business to tend to. And Mrs. Potiphar's there, and she comes out and she just grabs him. She says it again. Come on, I'm not messing. We're going to do this. And he, getting away from her, slips out of the coat he had on, and she's left holding her coat. A woman scorned. What's that saying about a woman scorned? You can say it. It's in church, I know. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And she makes up a lie about Joseph trying to attack her. And all the servants come running in. And her husband comes running in. And she says, oh, this Hebrew you brought in here is making fun of us. Look, here's what he's trying to. And Potiphar gets mad. And even though they'd had this long relationship of trust, loyalty and trust meant nothing. He winds up throwing Joseph into prison. So now, look, not only did his brothers do an injustice, Miss Potiphar did an injustice, and Potiphar himself has done an injustice, and he's in prison. But the master of the prison realizes God is also with him, even in prison. God, listen, it may seem, look at this guy's story. God really with you? God really with, listen, God was with him, and God continues to bless him, and pretty soon he's in charge of the whole prison, that the master of the prison doesn't even concern himself with anything that's going on. And so one day, two officials from Pharaoh's household, Pharaoh is the king, a name for the king, a title for the king of Egypt. Egypt was the bomb, right? That was the ruling power of the world. Nobody looked at Pharaoh and said, hey, what are you doing over there? No, he was top dog. And two of his officials wound up in the prison, the cupbearer and a baker, right? And these are not just a part of his kitchen staff, right? These were the folks that tested his food. These were high kind of standing official positions, and they wind up in prison. Joseph meets them. One day he's coming by, and these guys are really upset, down in the mouth. And he says, what's wrong? And they both had dreams the night before, and Joseph said, God can interpret dreams. Spill it. The cupbearer goes first, and Joseph says, let me tell you what that dream means. That means that in 3 days you're getting out of here, and you're going to be restored to your position. Would you just do one thing for me? Please, please. When you get out, remember me. Get me out of this prison. Get me out of this prison. Sounded pretty good to the baker, so the baker said, well, here's my dream, because it also had a number 3 in it. So Joseph says to him, okay, well, not such good news. You're getting out of prison in 3 days too, but Pharaoh's going to hang you in a tree and let the birds eat your flesh, and it's all over. 3 days go by. It happened exactly as Joseph said, but guess who forgot to say a word about Joseph? Once again betrayed. Once again an injustice. And the guy doesn't even think of him anymore. 2 more years go by, and Pharaoh has a dream. Got 2 dreams, right? Pharaoh dreams, first of all, it's an odd dream. Fat cows and the skinny cows eat the fat cows, but they're still skinny. Pharaoh wakes up and says, whoa, what's that all about? Goes back to sleep and dreams another dream about 7 fat ears of corn and 7 skinny ears of corn, and the skinny ears eat the fat ears, but they're still skinny. And I know eating corn, it's a dream. Remember, it's a dream, right? But you've had weird dreams. Okay? But 2 dreams, such similar messages, right there. Pharaoh wakes up and says, somebody is trying to tell me something. So he calls in his officials. Nobody has an idea, a clue even how to interpret that dream. And then the cupbearer says, oh, my shortcomings have been revealed to me, which seems kind of mild. You forget a guy for 2 years. I don't know. It doesn't seem fair, even at that. But he says, and so he tells him the whole story about what happened to him and how this guy in prison had told him their dreams. And Pharaoh says, get him in here. So you know the story, right? So they clean him up, and he's standing in front of Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, hey, I hear you can interpret dreams. I'm in chapter 41 now. If you got 2 pages, it's on this page about halfway down. Okay, I don't remember exactly what verse it is, but can you follow that? Y'all with me? Okay. And Pharaoh says, hey, I hear you interpret dreams. And Joseph says, I can't interpret dreams. But God can do anything. God's the one that interprets dreams. Let's hear it. So he tells him the 2 dreams, and Joseph says, hey, those dreams are saying the same thing. When you interpret one, you've interpreted both of them. And he says, here's what it means. 7 years of feast are coming. This is an agriculturally based culture, right? The rains are going to come right. Everything's going to be good. You're going to have this great harvest. It's going to be 7 fabulous years, but it's going to be followed by 7 years of crazy, crazy famine. And then he makes a suggestion to Pharaoh. Here's really the real meaning of the dream. Get somebody that can manage the feast years so that you'll have something to do in the famine years. And he lays out a few details about that. And Pharaoh is sitting there, and he's looking around at all of his staff, and he's saying, here's the guy right here. Could anybody find anybody wiser in all of Egypt? Well, those are all yes men. You don't argue with Pharaoh. They said, yeah, we think that's a good, choose him. He said, here's the guy. Let's put him in charge of all of it. Listen, Pharaoh made him the number 2 man in all of Egypt. Just like that. He made him, the text later says, the ruler of Egypt. Joseph referred to himself a little bit later on as the father of Pharaoh. Pharaoh paraded him through the land of Egypt with his signet ring. I mean, this is the guy. He said, there's only one way that I'm the bigger dog than you, and that's in terms of the throne. I'm on the throne. You're number 2 guy, but you're in charge of everybody else. Tables are starting to turn, all right? 7 years of feast go by. They're in about the 2nd year of famine, and not just Egypt, but all the countries in famine. And guess what's going on in Canaan, where 11 brothers, 22 years earlier, had sold their brother into slavery. They're starving. He's got 66 family members, small clan still at that point, 66 family members, and they're hungry. Jacob, they all heard there was grain in Egypt, so they sent the sons, you go get some grain for us. Here's the money you take, and take some gifts and go get it. Well, they head off to Egypt. One day, they walk into Joseph's dental office. They didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And if you're one of those revenge mongers, you like those kind of movies, right? You think, okay, here it comes. He even uses an interpreter. He could understand what they were saying, but he wanted to disguise himself, so he uses an interpreter to make it look like he doesn't understand what they're saying. And they're coming to buy grain, and he says, no, you're not. You're spies. You're coming here to find out the weak spots of our country so you can take it over. And they said, no, we're not doing that. We're really here. We're here to buy grain. No, he said, no, you are here. And your blood's starting to say, yeah, here it comes. Here it comes. No, you're going to, he spoke harshly to them, the text says. And I mean, he's really grinding it in. And they said, no, we're just a family. We got 11 brothers. We was 12. We don't have, one of them's gone now. They didn't go into a lot of detail about that because they're creeps, right, for doing that. But they just said one is no more, and we still got a baby brother still at home. And Joseph says, no, you're traitors. Here's the only way it's going to work. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to put all of y'all in prison except for one. He goes back, and you bring baby brother up here, and you say, man, revenge is sweet. It's going to be good. It's going to be good. You bring baby brother back, or you're not ever going to see you. And then he threw him in jail for 3 days to stew on it and to figure out, it says to examine them to see if they were telling the truth. I don't know what that looked like. The plan, 3 days go by. He actually changes the plan a little bit. All of y'all go back. Simeon, one brother, you stay until everybody comes back with baby brother. They go back down to Canaan. And by the way, he framed it. It made it look like they were stealing their money. He stuffed it back in their corn bags. You know that story. Maybe you don't, but anyway, that's what happened. And so they go back and they think, oh my, it looks like we've taken our money. We're back here. What are we going to do? And then they run out of grain. They run out of supplies. And they say, well, we need to go back. And they said to their daddy, we cannot unless we bring Benjamin. He said, no way, that's not going to happen. And they said, well, no use in us going back then, because he told us that if we came back without our brother, that was the end of the story. And Jacob would not budge. Finally, Reuben speaks up, and he says, you can kill 2 of my sons if I don't bring him back. What kind of family is that? Huh? He still won't budge. Judah speaks up and says, forget my sons. I put my life on the line if I don't bring this boy back. We could have already gone and come back twice, he said, if we would have done that. Jacob did not want to let Benjamin go. Forget Simeon, who's rotting in jail in Egypt, right? But Benjamin? No way. And finally he gives in because they're starving, right? So they all go back, and it's weird, as you can imagine. Joseph is still baiting the line. I mean, the revenge is going to be, because they deserve it. They deserve it. So he goes... He fixes it up where they get to return with their food, but he puts his special silver cup, plants it, Joseph does, in Benjamin's sack. And as they leave, it's a setup. You think, man, this is some kind. Arnold Schwarzenegger, get over. Move over. He puts that silver cup in his sack and then sends a battalion of soldiers out to capture them and said, you guys have stolen my cup. They said, no, we haven't. I'll tell you what, he said, the one in whose sack it's found is going to pay for this. It was in Benjamin's sack. It says they jumped up and they tore their clothes. The agony, I can't imagine. They go back. They're pleading for their lives. They're begging for the whole thing. You think, this is it. This is it. Justice is finally going to get served. And look what happens. Look at Genesis 45, verses 5 through 7. Joseph comes clean and he tells him, hey, I'm your brother. I mean, he was 17 last time they saw him. He's 39 now, right? You get the chronology is in the story. And he's telling them, I'm your brother. And they had been bowing down to him just as the dream had foretold. He said, look, don't be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land. And for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. He goes back, brings my dad in, and all the family is now in the land of Goshen, in the country of Egypt. Everybody taken care of. And the wind is a little bit out of your sails because somebody needed to get it in the neck, right? I told you this is not a story about justice. It's a story about injustice and forgiveness. But let me tell you what those brothers saw. They saw the glory of God. They saw the story of Jesus in that little baby brother. They had sold him. They had betrayed him. And he forgave them. I mean, look, why is the Joseph story in the Old Testament? Why is it there? Why is it there? Is it just so we'll have a good example? Here's what you need to do. Turn the other cheek. Right? Here's what you do. And you always have faith and you trust in God. What a great example he is. And you need to do that, and I need to do. Yeah, we all need to do that. I got that. And really, Paul says twice in the New Testament that the Old Testament is there for our example, right? But is that it? We also that's it, but that's not all of it, right? Surely no. We find out actually, this is part of the prophecy that God had given Abraham back in chapter 15. Do you remember Doug talking about that last week? The lantern that passed between the pieces, right? And God speaking to him, he says, look, I'm going to bless you. Now your people are going to be in slave for 400 years. I'm going to set them free and all of that kind of stuff. Didn't know where it was. This is how it all came about. It was through Joseph. They all came down into Egypt, and then they were in slave for 400 years. What happened? Well, the king, Exodus chapter 1, a king came up that did not know Joseph, right? Everything, history changes. It can change on a dime, right? So it's there to tell us how God's providential history is played out. But I want to tell you, it's more than that. It's telling us the story about Jesus. Now, I'm already out of time, so look here. Let me just tell you, I want you to look at this real quickly. In Luke 24, flip over to Luke 24, Tim Keller calls this Jesus' advanced hermeneutic class. Hermeneutics is how do you understand Scripture? How do you interpret Scripture? Luke 24, he starts talking about. Now, let me tell you what's going on in Luke 24. Jesus has already been crucified. 3 days later, rumors begin to circulate that he's risen. And it was just rumors because nobody walks out of a grave. Nobody comes back from the dead. It's just too hard to believe. The women on the third day went down there to tend to the body of Jesus, and the angels were there and said, "Hey, he's not here. He's gone." They go back and tell the apostles, tell the disciples, "Hey, we saw angels. He's not there." A bunch of them ran to the tomb to see it. And Luke 24 says that Peter looked at himself and he wondered. He said, What happened? I want you to know, folks, that's hard for everybody to believe. Man comes back from the dead? So that same day, you got two disciples that are leaving Jerusalem and walking to Emmaus. And Jesus appears to them. Doesn't say, Jesus, hey, if you can be raised from the dead, you can change your appearance, right? He disguised himself so they couldn't recognize him. They're walking along and they're talking, and Jesus speaks up. I'm in verse 17. What are you discussing together as you walk along? I love the next line. They stood still, their faces downcast. Sometimes you cannot chew gum and walk at the same time because the news is too dramatic. It's just too. They stop. Their faces are downcast. And one of them, named Clopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem? You don't know the things that have happened there in these last days?" "What things?" he said, still disguising himself. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him." Well, look at this, verse 21. "But we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. Some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." Some of the companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. They're still not believing, right? They're not sure what's going on. Here's what Jesus says, verse 25. "How foolish you are. How slow of heart to believe all that who? The prophets have spoken. Writers of the Old Testament, right? Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? It was prophesied. Death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus prophesied in the Old Testament. Verse 27, and beginning with Moses. Who wrote Genesis, y'all? Moses. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. The Old Testament is about Jesus Christ. The Word is filled with Jesus Christ. A little bit later, he reveals himself to them. I know I'm going a little bit long, but hang on with me just for a second. He reveals himself. They said, weren't our hearts burning within us? As he was opening up those scriptures, they run back to Jerusalem. They get the apostles and their little group together. Look here, verse 36. Everybody's talking about this whole road to Emmaus. Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. They were startled and frightened. Can you hear the chairs getting knocked over? Can you hear them? I mean, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, why are you troubled? Why do you doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and blood and bones as you see I have. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet, gaping holes. While they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement. At first they're not believing it because they're scared. And now they don't believe it. It's like, man, is it really you? You know, it's a difference, right? Do you have anything to eat? Verse 42, they gave him a piece of broiled fish. He took it and ate it, and he said to them, this is what I told you while I'm still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Only place in the Bible where the Old Testament is broken down into those three categories. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the Scriptures. He said, this is what's written. Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, including Houston, beginning in Jerusalem and including Houston. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, the Holy Spirit. Stay in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high. He said the Old Testament is filled with this story. When they preached in those days. They didn't have a New Testament. They preached from the Old Testament. Remember Acts chapter 8? The Ethiopian eunuch? He looked at Isaiah 53, and the Ethiopian eunuch, after the sermon, said, hey, here's water. What keeps me from being baptized? The Old Testament is a proclamation of the death, burial, and resurrection. It's about Jesus, you guys. And here's the news. We can be forgiven. You know why? Not because God just turns his back. Joseph just turned his back and absorbed all of it himself. But see, Jesus did the same thing. When you look at the cross of Jesus Christ, you know what you're seeing? Not just his grace. You're seeing the holiness of God. His baby boy had to die so that we could be forgiven. He had to die because of our sin and our junk, the little stuff and the big stuff. Don't think God is not holy. Don't think God is not a God of justice. Don't think God lets all of that stuff go. Look at the cross of Jesus Christ. You see the holiness of God, and you see the grace of Jesus Christ coming through. And I want you to know something. Thank God, thank God, thank God. Jesus Christ is alive. And I want to tell you, that is not a religious message. If you think I'm just talking about church stuff here, you've missed it. I'm speaking to the emptiness in every heart that is in here. The brokenness, the sense of law, guilt, all of it. Jesus, there is no answer other than Jesus Christ. And God raised him from that grave, seated him at his right hand, second only to the Father himself, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And now Jesus uses his resurrected power to forgive us, just like Joseph did his brothers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's a forgiveness like you can't imagine. One quick passage, 120 seconds, 2 minutes. Look at this, Hebrews 9. You think, he hadn't preached in a while and he's just getting it all out right now. I know what you're thinking. I know you people. Look at Hebrews 9. You always do it in Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is the book about the true and better. It's about Jesus, true and better. And he's comparing. He's looking at the Old Testament. He's looking into Jesus. He's been talking about Old Testament worship and the symbolism of it and how Jesus has fulfilled all of that. Here's what he says starting in verse 11. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle. He's not talking about the one in Jerusalem. He's talking about the one in heaven. Not man-made, that is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, sacrifices, for the forgiveness of sins in the Old Testament. But he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they're outwardly clean. Whatever it is that you do, you can kind of, but there's something down inside, right? How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience? What's that like? Lay it down. Lay it down because of what Jesus Christ has done. He's paid the penalty. That's not a religious message. That is a human message of victory, freedom. He can cleanse your conscience from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God. Let the church say amen.